Deep within the frozen woodlands of Montana, a delicate cry resonated among the trees, a sound so fragile it nearly vanished into the wind. It originated from a solitary German shepherd puppy, scarcely mature enough to stand, injured and enveloped by snow. Yet, the events that followed were beyond anyone's imagination. For just as death appeared inevitable, destiny intervened with a rifle, a heartbeat, and a renewed opportunity. What commenced as a savage assault would evolve into a saga of survival, sacrifice, and a connection between man and dog that even the forces of nature could not sever. The trees stood motionless in the frigid embrace of a Montana winter, their branches laden with frost, their silence punctuated only by the creaking of aged bark and the murmur of the wind. Yet, somewhere amidst those towering pines and boundless snowdrifts, a different sound permeated the air, barely more audible than a sigh. It was the sound of a whimper, faint and beseeching, the kind of sound that did not belong to the natural world, but to a creature forsaken within it. There, half submerged in a slush-encrusted trail near the timberline, lay a German shepherd puppy. His diminutive frame quivered uncontrollably, his paws raw, his fur matted with twigs and frozen blood. He moved in halting, agonizing steps, one paw dragging behind him as if it no longer responded to his body. No collar, no human scent, no indication of sustenance. He was simply there, alone, miles distant, in a weather-beaten cabin nestled between the jagged rocks of the Swan Range. Thomas Ridge was ambulating his property. At 63, Thomas possessed the kind of quietude that adheres to a man who has interred more than he has articulated. His countenance was lined not merely by age, but by isolation, each furrow like a chart of a past no one inquired about. He required little. Just his land, his tools, and his coffee invariably black. He ventured into town only when necessity dictated, and he certainly did not seek companionship. Yet that sound, that cry, it pierced something within him. He froze, his boots crunching the ice beneath, his head tilted. He waited, listening more intently. Another cry, this one more desperate, more broken. It was not the howl of a wolf or the moan of wind. This was something helpless, something teetering on the brink of demise. Thomas's initial inclination was not to intervene. His aged bones were too familiar with the cold, and his heart, colder than the frost, had not softened in years. But then that sound came again, and this time it was not solitary. Branches snapped in the distance. A low growl rose on the wind. Thomas squinted into the dense thicket. Something was out there, something larger than the pup. With his breath hanging in the cold air and his hand already reaching for the rifle slung across his back, Thomas stepped off the trail and into the forest's shadow. His boots sank into the snow as he moved swiftly and silently through trees he knew better than people. The cries were closer now, and with them came something else: urgency. Whatever was out there wasn't just hurting. It was being hunted. As Thomas crept forward, ducking beneath branches crusted with snow, he caught a glimpse of movement. Fur, small, shaking. And then, in the same instant, a massive brown blur charged from the trees ahead. A bear. The puppy didn't see it. He was collapsed near a shallow, frozen stream, too weak to even lift his head. The bear let out a sound that rattled the forest. Thomas's heart jumped. He raised the rifle, his hands trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something that had haunted him for far too long. The bear lifted a paw. The forest held its breath. And that's when the silence shattered. A single shot rang through the trees. The reverberation of the gunshot traversed the forest like a clap of thunder, bisecting time. The bear, mere inches from inflicting its lethal strike, halted in mid-motion, its head snapping towards the sound, ears twitching, muscles tensing. For an instant, everything froze. Tree limbs sagged in silence, breath hung like mist, and Thomas's heart pounded so vehemently he could feel it in his throat. Then the bear emitted a guttural roar, a final admonition, and with a furious stomp of its hind legs, it pivoted and crashed back into the undergrowth, shattering branches like brittle bones. Snow erupted in its wake, a violent retreat into the shadows from which it had emerged. And just like that, the predator was gone, but its damage remained. Thomas bolted forward without thought, his boots crunching down over the ruined trail. The puppy, tiny, motionless, silent, lay in a crumpled heap by the stream's edge, half his body stained in dark red. Thomas dropped to his knees, his breath tearing in and out of his chest as if fleeing something. His hands hovered before finally touching the limp fur. It was still warm. There was movement, barely, a shallow rise and fall of the chest. The pup wasn't dead, but it was close. Thomas ran his hand along the tiny frame, fingers trembling. The side had been raked by the bear's claws. Deep, bloody grooves ran through the thin fur and skin, the kind of wound that spelled a slow, painful demise in the wild. Thomas swallowed hard. "I've got you," he muttered, his voice raw and hoarse. The words escaped before he even realized he'd spoken. He hadn't planned this. He hadn't thought he'd be kneeling in the snow holding a dying dog he'd never seen before. But here he was, wrapping the tiny, fragile body in his ranger jacket as if the act alone might stitch the pup back together. The snow began to fall again, thicker now, the kind that covers tracks, buries trails, and swallows time. Thomas lifted the dog, pressing him gently to his chest. The warmth of life against him was faint but undeniable. It was a thread, and Thomas wasn't about to let go of it. He turned back the way he came, moving fast. The bear was out there somewhere, maybe watching, maybe waiting. But Thomas didn't care. Not anymore. Every step back to the cabin was a battle against slipping ice, aching knees, and the unbearable weight of the bleeding bundle in his arms. Inside the cabin, Thomas laid the pup on a folded blanket in front of the fireplace. He knelt beside him, hands soaked with blood and snowmelt. He didn't know if the puppy would survive the night, but something deeper than instinct, something buried and now reborn, made him whisper, "You hold on, boy. Just hold on." And then Thomas stood, jaw clenched, grabbed the truck keys from the nail by the door, and without another word, carried the dog out into the storm. There was only one place to go, one chance left, and he wasn't about to let another life slip through his fingers. Not tonight. The aged truck sputtered to life with a cough and a groan, its engine protesting the abrupt demand like a recalcitrant mule roused from its repose. Thomas paid it no mind. He slammed the door shut, set the heater to its maximum output, and glanced at the bundle on the passenger seat. Enveloped in his ranger jacket, the puppy barely stirred. The bleeding had diminished, but its respiration was shallow and erratic, as if each inhalation necessitated consent. Thomas gripped the steering wheel as if it were his anchor and maneuvered onto the snow-covered road that cleaved through the woods like a cicatrix. The headlights illuminated a corridor of trees, snow falling densely and unceasingly, blanketing the ground almost as rapidly as his tires could traverse it. 40 miles, that was the distance to Kalispell, the span between a life preserved and a life extinguished. He conversed with the pup throughout the journey, uttering quiet, fragmented sentences, primarily to prevent himself from succumbing to the silence that had characterized his cabin for years. "You're a fighter, huh? Got guts, I'll give you that," he remarked, his gaze alternating between the road and the dog. "Don't go quitting on me now. I didn't shoot that bear just so you could go and give up on me." The truck skidded on a curve, its tires sliding perilously close to the ditch, but Thomas maintained a steady grip on the wheel. The wind howled louder now, whipping snow across the windshield like tiny daggers. Visibility was severely impaired, road signs blurred, trees swayed, and periodically he had to lean forward merely to remain between the white lines, if they were even still discernible. Beside him, the dog emitted a soft, strained whimper. It was not a cry, but something else. Pain or perhaps fear. Thomas reached over, one hand still on the wheel, and gently touched the fur beneath the jacket. Still warm, still holding on. That was sufficient. He considered stopping more than once, but each time he did, he perceived something in the puppy's face, something familiar. It was not merely about survival. It was about significance, something to protect, something not to lose again. The radio remained off, the heater groaned, and the wipers labored incessantly just to maintain a sliver of clear glass. Thomas's eyes burned from the strain, but he continued driving as if time owed him a debt. Finally, the outskirts of Kalispell materialized through the storm. Dim streetlights, faint outlines of buildings, civilization. He turned sharply onto a back road, tires crunching gravel beneath fresh powder, and pulled up to a small white building with a faded wooden sign. Dr. Melissa Grant, Veterinary Medicine. The lights were off. Thomas slammed the truck into park and jumped out, his boots crunching in the snow. He yanked open the passenger door and cradled the dog again. Gentler now, more aware of the fragile weight he carried. He climbed the icy steps and pounded on the door with the flat of his hand. Nothing. Again. Harder. A light flickered on inside. Moments later, the door opened an inch, then all the way. Melissa stood in flannel pajamas, hair messy, eyes squinting in the porch light. "Thomas?" she asked, confusion written across her face, but her gaze dropped instantly to the bundle in his arms. Her expression changed. "I need help," he said, voice dry and cracked. "Now." Melissa stepped aside. "Bring him in." Thomas didn't hesitate. He pushed through the door into the warmth, the dog's blood already soaking through the coat. The clinic wasn't sterile like a city hospital. It smelled like antiseptic and pinewood floors, but it held something better. Urgency, purpose, a place where life might be saved. And for the first time in a very long time, Thomas allowed himself to believe that maybe it still could. The clinic's quietude was shattered by a sense of urgency. Melissa sprang into action, issuing swift directives to herself as she activated the overhead lights and pulled a blanket from the examination table. "Lay him here," she commanded, her voice steady yet tinged with apprehension. Thomas complied without delay. He positioned the dog gently, as if handling a delicate piece of glass, fearful that even the force of gravity might extinguish what little life remained. The moment Melissa drew back the jacket and observed the lacerations, her expression altered. The wounds were severe, deep and inflamed, encrusted with dried blood and matted fur. She could discern the swelling beneath the skin. Infection was already setting in. One misstep, one moment of hesitation, and it would proliferate faster than she could counteract it. She reached for her instruments. Thomas stood nearby, his fists clenched, his shoulders rigid, his breath shallow, as if he were containing more than just air. Holding back regret, fear, guilt. The fluorescent lights above seemed to hum more intensely with each passing second. The only sound beneath them was the faint, erratic panting of the dog. Thomas gazed at that diminutive chest, willing it to continue its rise and fall. "Don't give up on me," Melissa murmured, not to Thomas, but to the puppy. She cleansed the wound, disinfected the torn skin, and administered antibiotics intravenously. "He's strong, but he's losing too much blood." She did not soften the prognosis. Thomas nodded as if he already knew. Then, without warning, the heart monitor flatlined. A single, lifeless tone pierced the air. Melissa's hand flew to the defibrillator. "No, not yet." She placed the pads against the small rib cage, counted aloud, and delivered a shock. The body twitched. Nothing. Another shock. Pause, then barely a beep. One, then another. The line on the monitor spiked like a breath of wind fanning a dying flame. Melissa exhaled forcefully. "He's not done." Thomas hadn't realized he was gripping the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned white. His legs shook. It was a strange kind of relief, the kind that doesn't bring a smile, just allows one to breathe again. She continued working. Sutures closed the worst of the wounds, saline flushed through the fore. The dog was unconscious but no longer slipping away. His chest rose in steadier rhythms, now slower, stronger. He wasn't out of the woods, but he wasn't alone in them anymore. Melissa leaned back, her arms shaking. "He needs time. Antibiotics. Rest. Someone to watch him." "I'll take him," Thomas said, his voice low. Melissa turned, her eyes narrowing. "You? You live out in the woods. No cell service, no people. This pup needs around-the-clock care." "I'll do it," he repeated. His tone wasn't stubborn, it was final. She stared for a long second, searching his face, and something softened. "You always did show up when nobody else would." He looked down at the dog, battered, bandaged, breathing. "He's got fight. He's earned a shot." Melissa nodded slowly. "Then you better not let him down." Thomas reached out and laid a hand on the dog's paw. It was tiny, scarred, but alive, warm. The first truly living thing that had entered his world in a very long time. He stayed beside that exam table for hours, saying nothing, just sitting there, feeling the quiet heartbeat next to his palm. As the snowstorm outside swallowed the streets of Kalispell, inside that little clinic, something else was starting to thaw, not just a dog's fading pulse, but the faintest flicker of something long buried inside a man who had forgotten what hope felt like. By morning, the tempest had withdrawn into the hills like a creature aware it had overstayed its welcome. The thoroughfares of Kalispell were enveloped in a white stillness, and the clinic stood in that early light like a tranquil haven. Inside, Thomas had not stirred. He had not consumed food. He had barely rested. Yet his hand never relinquished the dog's paw, not for a single instant. There was a sacred quality to that stillness, a form of understanding that transcended words. The dog stirred beneath the blanket, almost imperceptibly, a flick of an ear, a shallow breath. It was a fragile pulse of life, yet it was life. Thomas leaned closer, his countenance etched with exhaustion and something more profound, something akin to prayer. The dog did not open his eyes, but the tremor in his ribs conveyed enough. He was trying. Melissa returned mid-morning, coffee in hand, her eyes scanning the vital signs. "The fever's breaking," she remarked. Still critical, but he made it through the night. She sounded surprised, as if she had not anticipated that outcome. "Maybe Thomas hadn't either," she added. "He can't stay here. I don't have space and he needs round-the-clock care." Thomas did not hesitate. "I'll take him." Melissa arched an eyebrow. "Your cabin's in the woods. No heating, no vet access, no backup." "You sure?" Thomas responded not with words but with action. He stood, gathered the fragile weight of the dog into his arms once more, and enveloped him in the same ranger jacket as if it were a suit of armor. His expression conveyed the rest. Melissa simply nodded. Outside, the wind bit at his skin, but Thomas didn't flinch. He moved like a man carrying something more than a wounded puppy. He was carrying purpose, maybe even penance. The truck's door groaned open, and the dog let out a faint whimper as he was nestled into the passenger seat. Thomas reached over, his hand brushing across the dog's head. "You're not alone now," he said, his voice just above a whisper. The drive back to Flathead Lake was slow. The road had turned to ice in places, and the forest watched silently from both sides. Every so often, Thomas glanced over. The dog didn't stir, but his breathing stayed steady. That was enough. Back at the cabin, the place felt different. Not warmer, just less empty. Thomas stoked the wood stove until the room glowed with amber heat. He spread an old wool blanket near the fire and gently laid the dog down. Then he patted it with towels and sat beside it as if guarding something sacred. Hours passed. Thomas moved slowly around the house, tending to the dog like he was tending to something buried inside himself. He ground up cooked chicken and spoon-fed it to the barely conscious animal. He changed bandages with hands that shook more from fear than age. He spoke not in grand speeches, just in pieces. "We'll get through this. You're safe now. One day at a time." The dog didn't respond at first. But then, just as Thomas was rinsing a cloth in the sink, he heard it, a sound so soft it almost vanished. The tail wagging just once, just enough. Thomas turned and stared. The dog's eyes were open, slits, but open. And then, with great effort, the dog shifted just enough to rest his nose against Thomas's boot. It wasn't a cry, or a bark, or a leap. It was something smaller, something quieter. It was trust. And in that moment, something cracked inside Thomas. Not broken. No, broken had happened long ago. This was different. This was a crack that let light in. He sat on the floor next to the dog, staring at the fire and the slowly rising chest beside him. No music, no words, just breathing. Two lives that had barely made it. Two stories no one else had read. And in the warmth of a fire built not just from wood, but from hope, they began together. The cabin near Flathead Lake had never truly felt like a home. It was more of a refuge, a place where Thomas Ridge existed in silence, not in tranquility. The fire perpetually burned, yet it seldom warmed much beyond the walls. The furniture creaked, and the wind pressed against the windows as if desiring entry to complete what life had initiated, gradually eroding him. But now a change had occurred. The dog lay nestled beside the stove, enveloped in Thomas's ranger jacket. He had not moved significantly since their return, but his respiration was stronger. His eyes, when they opened, did not dart with alarm. They blinked slowly, absorbing the dim light and the warmth that enfolded the room like a second skin. Thomas sat nearby, meticulously shredding pieces of chicken with the same diligence one would apply to restoring a delicate timepiece. Every motion was deliberate. The silence between them was not the kind that begged to be filled, it was the kind that created space for something new, something neither of them had experienced in a very long time. Trust arrived slowly, quietly, but it arrived. By the second day, the dog attempted to lift his head. Thomas, observing the movement from the corner of his eye, leaned in. "Easy," he murmured. "No rush." The dog licked his dry lips and let out a soft whine. That sound, barely louder than a sigh, landed like thunder in Thomas's chest. He cooked broth that morning, no salt, just warmth. He cooled it and fed the dog with a spoon, bit by bit. The pup didn't fight it, didn't resist, he accepted it. And then he did something that froze Thomas mid-motion. He nudged the bowl with his nose, just a little, asking for more. It wasn't hunger, it was hope. Thomas smiled without realizing it, and that smile stayed a little longer than the others that had come and gone over the years. That night, snow dusted the windows like powdered sugar. The sky outside held the kind of quiet that made you feel small. Thomas laid a second blanket near the fire and sat on it. He didn't bother with the chair, he didn't want distance. The dog was sleeping now, his belly rising and falling with a rhythm Thomas began to recognize as comfort. Before drifting off, the dog did one thing more. He stretched his paw just far enough to touch Thomas's leg. The connection wasn't loud, it wasn't grand. It was a heartbeat passed through the tips of two survivors who had learned too much about loneliness. On the third day, Thomas found himself talking, not just one-liners, but real sentences. He told the dog about how he used to work these woods, how the cold never bothered him back then, how he stopped lighting the second lamp because no one ever came by. He didn't speak for sympathy, he spoke because it finally felt like someone was listening. And when he said aloud, "You need a name," he expected silence. But the dog blinked once, then let out a low, soft sound, a half-breath, half-grunt. It sounded like agreement. Thomas thought for a long time. Then he looked down and said, "Dog? Your dog. Not Buddy. Not Max, not anything sugar-coated. Just dog. Plain. Strong. Honest." Dog didn't flinch. If anything, his tail twitched once beneath the blanket. That night, Thomas didn't go to bed. He sat by the fire again, next to Dog. And while wind howled through the Montana hills and frost kissed the edges of the windows, the two of them stayed close, wrapped in the kind of warmth that doesn't come from wood or wool, but from something far older, far deeper. Aside though, something moved, something watching, not curious, not lost, waiting. The ensuing days introduced a tranquil rhythm to the cabin, wood crackling in the stove, wind rustling against the pines, and the subtle sounds of recuperation. Dog was stronger now, the limp persisted, and his ribs still protruded through his thin fur, but a light shone in his eyes. He followed Thomas from room to room with a slow determination, observing every movement as if it held significance. And perhaps it did. Perhaps everything mattered now. Thomas had even begun conversing more, partly to himself, partly to Dog, discussions about snow levels, the persistent leak in the roof, or how the stew required more salt. Dog listened, sometimes with a languid blink, sometimes with a twitch of his ear, sometimes with a thump of his tail against the floorboards. They were learning each other's language, one shared silence at a time. Then came the marks. It was late afternoon. Thomas had stepped out to chop firewood behind the cabin, Dog trailing slowly but without hesitation. The air smelled of pine and damp bark, but something else lingered, a coppery tension clinging to the wind. That was the first indication. The second arrived when Dog stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed on the woods behind the shed, his hackles raised, his breath low and shallow. Thomas turned, following his gaze, and saw it, claw marks, deep, fresh, gouged into the side of the shed like a warning inscribed in rage. Thomas froze. The size, the spacing, there was no mistaking it. The bear had returned. Adrenaline flooded his system as if his body recognized the threat before his mind could process it. He dropped the axe and scanned the tree-line, but the woods had gone still. Too still. Even the birds were silent. That kind of silence doesn't mean peace, it means something's watching. He ushered Dog back into the cabin and bolted the door behind them. The old boards groaned with the weight of sudden urgency. Thomas checked the windows, fastened them tight, and lit a line of lanterns along the porch. His hands trembled as he loaded the rifle, not from age, but from memory. His breath quickened. He knew better than to wait until the next attack. He'd seen how quickly violence could strike. He'd lived with the ghost of it every day. But now he had something to lose again, and losing it wasn't an option. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat by the fire with the rifle beside him, Dog curled nearby, muscles tense even in sleep. The air inside the cabin was warm, but the cold outside had taken on something sinister, as if the woods weren't just cold anymore, they were watching. At one point, just past midnight, a branch cracked outside. Thomas rose, rifle in hand. Another sound, a low growl, distant but heavy. Then silence. No footfall, no retreat, just that empty, endless silence that screams with dread. Dog stood too, his body trembling, not from pain, but instinct. He knew the sound. He remembered it. The bear wasn't just passing through, it was returning, claiming something, or maybe hunting for something it didn't finish. Thomas didn't speak, didn't whisper, just walked slowly to Dog's side and placed a firm hand on his back. In that single touch, a promise was made, whatever came next, they would face it together. The sky remained an inky black when the sound recurred, nearer this time, a branch fracturing under immense weight, a respiration heavier than the wind, a subdued growl that did not echo but settled in the chest like a silent countdown. Thomas did not flinch. He was already standing, rifle in hand, boots laced, his mind racing yet his body steady. Dog stood beside him, rigid, alert, his eyes fixed on the dark woods beyond the porch window. Every muscle in his fragile frame was taut like wire, attention held together by sheer will to protect. Then the crash. The rear of the shed yielded with a thunderous crack, the sound ripping through the stillness like a war drum. The bear was no longer stalking. It was charging, driven by hunger, fury, instinct, or perhaps some ancient memory of unfinished business. Thomas barely had time to react. He swung the door open and stepped out, rifle raised. And then Dog moved first. He sprinted past Thomas, faster than he had any right to be after all he'd endured. No hesitation, no fear, just pure, blistering loyalty. He planted himself between the bear and the porch steps, barking, snarling, trembling, but not retreating. The bear halted for a breath, its hulking figure silhouetted against the tree-line. Then it lunged. Thomas yelled, a sound half command, half scream. But it was too late. The bear's massive paw struck Dog, hurling him sideways into the snow with a yelp that split the air. For a second, everything slowed. The white blur of Dog's body, the low growl of the bear, the scream caught in Thomas's throat. But Dog didn't stay down. Bruised, bleeding, limping, he stood back up. And this time his bark was louder, angrier. A defiant cry from something small, refusing to surrender to something monstrous. And it worked. The bear flinched. Thomas saw the opening. His hands moved on instinct. The rifle raised. The breath steadied. The shot rang out. It wasn't aimed to kill, only to warn. The sound echoed like thunder rolling across the hills, bouncing through the trees. The bear froze mid-motion, eyes locking with Thomas's across the clearing. And in that still second, something passed between man and beast, a line neither wanted to cross again. The bear snarled, turned, and vanished into the woods without a trace, leaving only blood in the snow and steam in the air. Thomas dropped the rifle and collapsed to Dog's side. His hands trembled as he gathered him close. Blood stained the snow, soaking through the ranger jacket. Dog's breathing was shallow but steady, eyes fluttering, barely conscious but alive. "I've got you," Thomas whispered. "I've got you." There were no words for what passed between them in that moment. No sentence strong enough to carry the weight of what they had just survived. Just a man and a dog, both broken in places no one else could see, holding on to the one thing neither thought they'd ever find again. Someone worth fighting for. And in that silence after the storm, one truth became clear. The man who had lost everything had just been given something back. And the dog who had once been abandoned now had something no bear could ever take. A place where he belonged.